Hattie Dunmore stepped down from the stagecoach into a town that had already decided what it thought of her. She felt it the way you feel weather coming, a pressure against the skin before the first drop ever falls. The men outside the mercantile stopped their talking. Two women beneath the awning of the dress shop leaned their heads together, and one of them smiled the kind of smile that was not a smile at all. Hattie set her carpetbag down in the dust of the Cedar Bend Road and pretended, as she had learned to pretend across 36 years of living, that she did not notice any of it. She was a big woman. There was no gentle way around the fact, and Hattie had long ago stopped looking for one. She was broad through the shoulders and broad through the hips, soft in the belly and soft in the arms, with a round face that flushed easily and a chin that had a second one hiding beneath it when she looked down. Her dress was clean but plain, a faded blue calico let out twice at the seams, and over it she wore a gray shawl that had been her mother's. Her chestnut hair was pinned up under a straw bonnet gone soft at the brim. She was not a woman that men wrote poems about. She had been told this in one way or another her whole life. If you have ever walked into a room and felt the air change because of the shape of your body, if you have ever been told you were too much or not enough, too big or too plain or too old to be wanted, then stay with me. This is a story about a woman the world looked past, and the two small children who looked straight at her and saw everything the world had missed. Follow Hattie all the way to the end, and when you get there, tell me in the comments what town you're watching from. I want to know how far this story travels. Now let me take you back to that dusty road in Cedar Bend, Wyoming in the spring of 1884, where a heavyset widow with $4 to her name had just arrived to marry a man she had never met. The letter that brought her was folded twice inside her glove, worn soft as cloth from all the time she had read it. It was not a romantic letter. Elias Crane was not, she gathered, a romantic man. He had written in a plain hand that he was a widower with 2 children, that his ranch lay 6 miles north of Cedar Bend in the foothills of the Wind River Range, that he required a wife who could cook and keep a house and mother 2 small twins who had lost their own mama 2 winters back. He had written that he could offer a roof, 3 meals, and honest respect, and that he could not offer more than that and would not pretend otherwise. He had asked at the very bottom, in smaller letters, as though he were ashamed of the question whether she minded hard work. Hattie had written back that she had never known any other kind. She had not told him she was fat. She had told him she was 36 and widowed and childless, that her husband Josiah had died of the fever the autumn before and left her nothing but his debts, that she could bake bread and set a bone and birth a calf and read scripture aloud of an evening. She had told him the truth about everything except her body. And she had done that on purpose, because she had learned that if you gave a man that one fact first, he never troubled himself to learn any of the others. She had sent a small photograph taken years ago from the shoulders up in soft light. It was not a lie, but it was not the whole truth either, and she knew it, and the knowing sat in her stomach like a swallowed stone as the man she had come to marry walked up the road toward her. She knew him at once, though she had no picture of him. He was tall, and he moved the way tired men move, as though the ground itself asked something of him with every step. He was somewhere past 40, broad in the shoulder, dark hair gone gray at the temples, and a short beard the same, and his eyes, when they found her, were the flat gray blue of a winter sky that has not decided whether to snow. He wore a canvas coat gone pale at the elbows and a wide brown hat, and he carried himself like a fence post that had been standing a long time in weather. He stopped 10 feet from her. She watched his gaze travel down and back up, quick, the way a man checks a horse he suspects he has been cheated on. She watched the disappointment arrive in his face and settle there, and she made herself keep her chin up while it happened. "Mrs. Dunmore," he said. It was not a question. There was no one else it could be. "Mr. Crane," her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I hope the road wasn't long for you." He didn't answer that. He was still looking at her, and there was no cruelty in his face, which was somehow worse than cruelty. Cruelty she could have braced against. This was just a man doing sums in his head and coming up short. "The photograph," he began, and then stopped, because he was not, she would learn, a man who liked to say unkind things out loud even when he was thinking them. The photograph was taken some years ago, Hattie said, and she said it plainly, because there was no use in either of them pretending, and it was taken from the shoulders up. I imagine you can see why. She bent, with the small grunt she could never quite hide, and picked up her carpetbag. "I won't hold you to anything, Mr. Crane. If you want to put me back on that coach, it doesn't leave till tomorrow noon, and I'll sit in the churchyard till then and be no trouble to anybody. I've been a disappointment to folks before. I know how to do it quietly." Something in the way she said it seemed to reach him. He looked at her a moment longer, and the winter in his eyes shifted, not toward warmth exactly, but toward a kind of weary honesty that answered her own. "I didn't say I was putting you back on the coach," he said. "I said the photograph was taken some years ago." He reached out and took the carpetbag from her hand before she could stop him, and the small courtesy of it undid something in her chest that she had been holding tight since Ohio. "Wagon's this way. I've got the children with me. I'd ask you not to make promises to them you don't mean to keep. They've had enough of that. I never make promises I don't mean to keep," Hattie said. "It's the only kind of wealth a poor woman's got." He led her down the road toward a buckboard wagon hitched to a pair of patient bays. And it was there, standing in the wagon bed with their hands gripping the rail, that she first saw the twins. She would remember that moment for the rest of her life, the way you remember the first time you saw the ocean or the face of your own mother bent over your cradle. There were 2 of them, a boy and a girl, and they could not have been more than 7 years old. They were dressed in clothes that had been mended by a man's hands, which is to say, mended honestly and badly, the stitches too big, a button sewn on with the wrong color thread. The boy had his father's dark hair and his father's wary eyes. The girl's hair was lighter, the color of wet straw, and it hung in 2 braids that had been plaited without love, lopsided, the parts crooked, and Hattie understood at once, before she was told anything, that no woman had touched that child's hair in a long time. They stared at her. Children stare. It is not unkindness in them, only honesty they haven't yet been taught to hide. But there was something in the way these 2 looked at her that was different from the way the town had looked at her, and it took Hattie a moment to understand what it was. The town had looked at her body. These children were looking at her face. The girl in particular fixed her with a gaze so open and so hungry that Hattie felt it like a hand laid flat against her breastbone. "This is Mrs. Dunmore," Elias said to them, in the careful voice a man uses when he is not sure of the ground under his own feet. "She's come to help us keep the house. Mind your manners now. Are you going to be our mama?" the girl said. The question fell into the quiet like a stone into a still pond, and Hattie watched Elias's whole body go rigid with it. "Ada," he said, low, a warning and a wound both. But the girl, Ada, did not look at her father. She looked at Hattie, and she waited, and her small, dirty hand tightened on the wagon rail, and Hattie understood that this was not a child asking an idle thing. This was a child who had learned to ask the important question fast, before the grown-ups could make the answer complicated, because she had learned that grown-ups made everything complicated, and that if you wanted the truth, you had to grab for it quick. Hattie came to the side of the wagon, and because she was a large woman, it brought her nearly to the child's eye level without her having to bend far. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," she said, and she said it gently, and she said it true, because Elias had asked her not to make promises, and this was the most honest thing she could give the girl. "I've only just got here. But I'll tell you what I do know. I know how to make bread that comes out soft in the middle, and I know how to braid hair so it lies down flat and doesn't pull, and I know how to stay. Whatever else happens, I'm not a woman who runs off. So how about you and me start with the hair, and we'll let the rest come as it comes." The boy, Samuel, had not said a word, but Hattie saw his eyes go to his sister's crooked braids, and then to Hattie's face, and she saw him file the offer away somewhere behind his careful little expression, the way his father filed things away, and she thought, "These are grieving people, all three of them, and grief has made them quiet, and quiet is a thing I know how to be patient with." The ride out to the ranch took the better part of 2 hours. Elias drove without much talking, and Hattie did not press him, because she had ridden beside enough silent men to know that silence is sometimes the only conversation a person has left in them. The land opened up as they left the town behind, rolling in gold and vast, the grass rippling like water where the wind moved through it. And far ahead, the Wind River Mountains stood blue and remote with snow still clinging to the high places even in May. It was beautiful country, hard and beautiful. The kind of country that would kill you if you turned your back on it and feed you for a lifetime if you didn't. Hattie had grown up on an Ohio farm and had spent her married years on a poorer one, and she knew land. And she looked at this land and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was the small, dangerous stirring of hope. Behind her in the wagon bed, the children had grown bolder. Ada had crept forward until she was pressed against the back of the seat directly behind Hattie, and every so often Hattie felt a small finger touch the fabric of her shawl, testing it, the way you might touch something to be sure it was real. Samuel stayed back, watchful, but he had stopped scowling. When they crested a low rise and the ranch came into view below them, a weathered gray house with a stone chimney, a barn, a scatter of outbuildings, a corral where a few horses stood switching their tails, it was Ada who spoke. "That's our house," she said to Hattie, proudly, as though she were showing off something precious, and Hattie's heart cracked a little, because she understood that the child was not really showing off the house, she was showing off her life. She was saying, "Here is where we are, here is everything we have, please find it good enough, please find us good enough." Hattie had spent her whole life on the other side of that question. She knew exactly how it felt to hold your small life up to a stranger and pray they didn't laugh. "It's a fine house," Hattie said, and meant it. "It's got good bones. And that chimney's drawing straight, which means somebody built it right and somebody keeps it clean. You can tell a lot about a family from a chimney." Ada beamed. Behind her, Samuel said, so quietly Hattie almost missed it, "Papa built the chimney." And Elias, up on the seat beside her, said nothing at all. But Hattie saw his jaw work once, and she understood that the boy had just paid his father the highest compliment he knew how to pay, and that the father had heard it, and that between the two of them lay an ocean of things they did not know how to say. The house, when they went inside, told her everything the letter had not. It was a man's house now, and a grieving man's house at that. It was not dirty, exactly, but it had the particular bleakness of a place kept by someone who has stopped believing that keeping it matters. The floor was swept, but the corners were gray. There were dishes clean and stacked, but a film of old grease on the stove that no one had scrubbed in months. A woman's apron hung on a peg by the door, faded, untouched, and Hattie knew without asking that it had been the dead wife's, and that no one in this house could bear either to wear it or to take it down. There were 2 small beds in the loft and 1 big bed downstairs. And on the wall above the big bed there was a framed photograph of a slender, pretty woman with light hair and a soft mouth. And the twins had the woman's chin, both of them, and Hattie looked at that photograph and felt no jealousy at all, only a great tender sorrow for everyone in the room. Her name was Margaret, Elias said. He had followed her gaze. His voice was flat, but Hattie had learned to hear the thing under the flatness. Maggie, she passed 2 winters ago. There was another baby coming, and it came wrong, and I couldn't get the doctor out in time. The snow was too deep, and I lost them both in one night. He said it the way a man says a thing he has said to himself 10,000 times in the dark. I brought her out here. She didn't want to come. Ohio suited her fine. I'm the one wanted the land. He turned away and set her carpetbag down at the foot of the loft ladder. You'll sleep up in the loft with the children. I'll take the barn. I want that understood from the start. Mrs. Dunmore, I didn't send for a wife because I wanted one. I sent for a wife because those 2 children need a mother more than they need a father who's any use to them. And I'm not any use to them. I don't know how to braid hair. I don't know what to say when Ada cries at night. I burn everything I cook. I sent for you because I've failed them, and I'm too proud to keep failing them alone. It was the longest speech she would hear him make for many weeks, and Hattie stood in the middle of that sad, clean house and understood that she had not, after all, married a hard man. She had married a broken one, which was different and in some ways harder and in some ways easier, because broken things can sometimes be mended, whereas hard things only wait to break you. Mr. Crane, she said, I'm going to say one thing and then I'll not bring it up again. A man who blames himself for the snow is a man who thinks he's God. You're not God. You couldn't have got that doctor through, and no man living could have, and if your Maggie's watching from wherever the good Lord keeps the ones we lose, I don't believe for 1 minute she's blaming you. Now, where do you keep your flour? Those children are thin, and I intend to change that starting tonight. He looked at her for a long moment. It was not a warm look, but it was the first look he had given her that had a person behind it instead of a wall. Pantry's off the kitchen, he said. There's flour, some lard, not much else worth speaking of. And then, at the door, with his hand on the frame, not turning around, he said, I'm obliged to you for what you said about the snow. And he went out to the barn, and Hattie rolled up her sleeves, and she got to work. She found the pantry near bare, as he'd warned, but there was flour, and there was lard, and there was a crock of sourdough starter gone sluggish and sour with neglect, and Hattie looked at that starter and felt a kinship with it, because she too was a thing that had been left too long in a cold place and had gone a little sour for want of tending. She fed it. She stoked the stove until it roared, and she scrubbed the old grease off the top of it with sand and lye until the iron shone black and honest. She sent Samuel to the well for water and Ada to the henhouse for eggs, and the children ran to do it, as though being given a task by a woman in the kitchen was the most wonderful thing that had happened to them in 2 years, which, Hattie suspected, it very nearly was. By the time the sun went down behind the mountains, the house smelled of bread. It is a particular smell, baking bread, and it does a particular thing to a house and to the people in it. It is the smell of somebody caring enough to wait, because bread cannot be hurried, bread takes its own slow time, and a house that smells of it is a house where someone has decided to stay long enough to see a thing through. The twins hovered near the stove, drawn to the warmth and the smell like 2 small cold moths to a lamp. And when Hattie pulled the first golden loaf from the oven and set it on the board to cool, Ada made a sound that was almost a sob. "You have to let it cool a minute," Hattie told her, "or it'll burn your mouth and gum up doughy inside. Bread's like most good things. It's worth the waiting." But she cut the heel off while it was still too hot, because she was not made of stone. And she buttered it and put it in the child's hands, and she watched Ada eat it with her eyes closed, and she watched Samuel edge close and hold out his own hand without a word, and she cut him a slice too, and she thought her heart would break clean in half with the simple, terrible tenderness of feeding 2 hungry children who had forgotten what it was to be fed by someone who wanted to. Elias came in from the barn when Hattie rang the triangle by the door, and he stopped on the threshold, and Hattie watched him take in the table. She had set it properly. She had found a cloth in the bottom of a trunk, a plain white one, and she had washed the dust off the good plates, and she had put the bread in the center on a board with a crock of butter and a pot of stewed dried apples she had sweetened with the last of the sugar. It was not a rich meal. It was flour and lard and apples and a pot of beans she'd had going since afternoon. But it was a made meal, a meal that somebody had thought about and taken trouble over, and Hattie saw the difference land on Elias Crane like weather. He took off his hat. He had not, she suspected, taken off his hat at his own table in a long time. They ate mostly in silence, but it was a different silence than the one in the wagon. The children ate like they were afraid the food might be taken away, hunching over their plates, and it took Hattie 3 days to break them of that. 3 days of saying gently, "There's more, there's always more, eat slow, nobody's going to take it." But that first night they ate fast, and they ate a great deal, and Ada fell asleep at the table with a crust still in her hand. And Elias rose and gathered the little girl up in his arms with a tenderness that surprised Hattie, that made her look away, because it felt like watching something private. He carried her up the loft ladder and laid her in her bed, and when he came down his face had changed, had loosened somehow, and he stood at the bottom of the ladder and looked at Hattie washing the dishes in the tin basin, and he said, "She hasn't fallen asleep easy in 2 years. Cries most nights. Something about the dark." He seemed to want to say more and not to know how. "That's all," he said finally. "Just, that's all." And he went out to the barn. Samuel was still awake, sitting by the stove, watching Hattie work with those careful, dark eyes. She let him watch. She did not force him to talk, because she had been a quiet child herself, forced too often into conversations she did not want by adults who mistook her silence for something that needed fixing. When she had finished the dishes, she sat down in the chair by the stove near the boy, not too near, and took out her mending. because she had seen the state of their clothes, and she began to work on the wrong-colored button on his Sunday shirt, replacing it with a right-colored one from her own store of buttons, which she had carried across half a country in a tobacco tin, because a woman never knew when she would need a button. "You so good," Samuel said. It was the first full thing he had said to her. "I've had practice," Hattie said, not looking up, because she sensed that looking up would spook him. "My mama taught me. She used to say a woman with a needle is never truly poor, because she can always mend what she's got and make it last." She snipped the thread. "You want to learn? It's a useful thing to know. Your papa can't be sewing on your buttons out in the barn." Samuel considered this with the gravity of a much older man. "Papa can't sew," he confided. "He tries. Ada's braids come out crooked, and my buttons fall off, and he burns the mush every morning, and he doesn't ever say so, but I know it makes him sad." He was sad before you came. He looked at her, and there was something almost pleading in it, though he was too young to know that was what it was. "Are you going to make him less sad? Ada asked if you were our mama, and you didn't say yes. But are you going to stay? Because if you're going to leave again like the other ladies, I'd rather you left now, before Ada gets used to you. She gets used to people. I don't." Hattie set down her mending. This was, she understood, the most important conversation she had had since she stepped off the coach. More important than any she had had with the boy's father, because children do not deal in the pretenses that grown people hide behind, and the boy was asking her the true question, the only question, the one Elias had warned her against answering carelessly. She did not answer it carelessly. "Samuel," she said, "I'm going to tell you the truth, because I can see you're a boy who'd rather have a hard truth than a soft lie, and I respect that, because I'm the same. I don't know yet if I'm going to be your mama. That's a big word, and it belongs to your sister up there who's already gone, and I won't take it lightly. But here is what I can promise you, and I don't make promises I don't keep. I am not going to leave. Not tomorrow, not next month, not when the town says ugly things about me, and they will, and not when your papa and I have our first quarrel, and we will. I came here to stay, and I'm going to stay, and you can get used to me or not, that's your business, but I'll be here either way. Now hand me your other shirt. That collar's coming apart, and I'll not have you going to church in rags while I've got two good hands." The boy looked at her for a long moment. Then he got up, and he went to the loft ladder, and he climbed halfway, and he stopped, and he said, without turning around, in the exact way his father said things without turning around, "Ada likes her braids not too tight. Mama used to do them loose." And then he climbed the rest of the way up and was gone, and Hattie sat by the stove with his shirt in her lap and let herself cry, quietly, the way she had learned to cry, so that no one would hear and be troubled by it. The first weeks on the Crane ranch settled into a rhythm, the way even the strangest new lives will settle if you give them a little time and a great deal of work. Hattie rose before the sun and had the stove going and the coffee on before Elias came in from the barn, and she learned his ways and he learned hers, and though they spoke little, the speaking they did began to have less winter in it. She fed the sourdough every day until it grew lively and generous. She scrubbed the gray out of the corners of the house and washed the windows until the light came through clean, and she took down the dead woman's apron from its peg one morning, gently, and folded it, and put it away in the trunk with the good tablecloth, not because she wanted it gone, but because she had come to understand that a house cannot heal while it is holding its breath. And that apron had been the whole house holding its breath for 2 years. She half expected Elias to be angry. He came in and saw the empty peg and stood looking at it a while, and then he looked at Hattie, and he said only, "Thank you," in a voice gone rough, and went back out. She understood they had reached an agreement about grief without ever once naming it out loud. She braided Ada's hair every morning. That was the ritual that mattered most, though it was the smallest thing. Every morning she sat the little girl on the stool by the window in the good light, and she brushed out the wet straw hair until it shone. And she talked to her while she did it. Nonsense mostly, the sky and the chickens and what they'd have for supper. And she braided it loose the way Maggie used to, and she tied it with ribbons she'd cut from the hem of one of her own petticoats and dyed with berry juice, blue and pink and a soft green. And Ada, who had cried in the dark for 2 years, began to sleep through the night. Hattie noticed it before Elias did, because Hattie slept in the loft an arm's length from the child's bed. And she woke each night out of habit to listen for the crying, and one night there was no crying, and the next night none. And Hattie lay in the dark listening to the 2 children breathe slow and easy, and she thought, "This is what I was made for, this exact thing. And no one ever told me, and I almost went to my grave without knowing it." It was Samuel who took the longer road to healing, as Hattie had known he would from that first night by the stove. Ada's grief had been a child's grief, loud and near the surface, the kind that comes out in nightmares and comes right with braided hair and bread and a steady arm in the dark. But Samuel had grieved the way his father grieved, down deep and silent, packed away where it wouldn't show, and a grief like that does not come out for braiding. It has to be waited for. Hattie waited for it. She did not push the boy, did not pry, did not ask him how he felt, which she had learned was the surest way to shut a quiet child up tight as a drum. She simply made room. She let him help her in the kitchen when he wanted to, and let him be when he didn't. And she praised his work honestly and never falsely, and she answered his questions, of which he had a great many, all of them careful, and none of them ever about the thing that mattered. And then, one afternoon in the middle of July, out of nothing, while they were shelling peas together on the porch step in the shade, the boy said, not looking at her, his small fingers busy with the pods. I can't remember what her voice sounded like anymore. He said it flat, the way his father said hard things. Mama's voice. I try at night and I can't hear it. I can remember her face on account of the picture. But the picture doesn't have her voice. And I'm forgetting it, and I don't want to forget it, and I can't make it stop. And a tear fell off the end of his nose into the pan of peas, and he wiped his face angrily with the back of his wrist, ashamed, and kept shelling. Hattie set down her own peas. She did not gather him up. He was not Ada. He would not have wanted that. It would have broken something instead of mending it. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, giving the boy's confession the dignity of not being rushed at, and then she said, gently, still shelling her peas so he wouldn't feel stared at, "That's the cruelest trick grief plays, I think. Not the big things, the little things it steals when your back's turned. I lost my own mama when I was near your age, and I can't tell you her voice either, not any more, not the true sound of it." The boy went still, listening. "But here's the thing I learned, Samuel, and it took me a long while to learn it, so I'll give it to you now and save you the wait. You're not forgetting her because you love her less. You're forgetting the sound of her voice because you're a living boy and living things grow, And growing forward means some things behind you get smaller, and that's not a betrayal. That's just the price of staying alive, and she'd not begrudge you it. Not for a minute. Your mama didn't die so you could stop living too. And the love, now, the love doesn't go where the voice went. The love stays. You'll carry that your whole life, long after the voice is gone, and one day you'll have children of your own, and you'll love them with a love that's got your mama's love folded up inside it. And that's how she keeps going. Not in the voice, in the loving. You can't lose that one. It's sewed in too deep. The boy shelled his peas in silence for a long time after that, but he had moved at some point without seeming to, so that his shoulder was leaned up against Hattie's soft arm, the whole warm weight of him tipped against her, and they finished the peas that way, leaned together in the shade, and it was the first time Samuel Crane had let himself be held since his mother died. Though neither of them called it that, and both of them knew it was. Something loosed in the boy that afternoon that never bound up tight again. He laughed more after. He slept without the bad dreams. And though it would be a long while yet before he found the word for what Hattie was to him, from that day on he stopped watching her like she might vanish, and started leaning on her like she might stay, which she had told him that first night she meant to do. Word of her got to town, of course. It always does. The Crane Ranch was 6 miles out, but 6 miles is nothing to gossip, which travels on horseback and on foot and on the wind and needs no road. The first Sunday Elias took them all into church. Hattie in her one good dress with the twins, scrubbed and shining beside her, and she felt the whole congregation turn to look as they came through the doors, and she heard the whisper move through the pews ahead of her like wind through wheat. There goes Crane with the fat one he sent away for. Did you ever? And him with poor Maggie not cold, and her the size of a barn door. Would you look? Hattie kept her chin up and her eyes forward, and she walked her children to a pew and sat them down, and she sang the hymns in her clear, strong voice. Because she had a good voice, it was the one thing about herself she had never doubted. And she would not let a room full of small hearts steal the one gift the Lord had troubled to give her. But it was after the service in the churchyard that Hattie first met Genevieve Ashby, and understood that the town's whispering was the least of what she would have to weather. Genevieve was a widow too, but she was the other kind of widow, the kind the world makes room for. She was slender and fair and not yet 30, with a small waist and a black dress cut to show it, and a face that had never once in its life had a door closed in it, on account of its shape. She came across the churchyard with 2 other women flanking her like a general with her aides, and she smiled at Hattie, and it was Cedar Bend's own particular smile, the one that was not a smile at all. "You must be the woman Elias sent for," Genevieve said, and she let her eyes do their traveling, slow up and down, making sure Hattie saw her do it. "How very brave of you to come all this way, and how very like Elias to be practical about it. I did wonder who he'd find willing." She reached out and touched Ada's braided hair, and Ada flinched back against Hattie's skirts. And Hattie put a hand on the child's shoulder. "Why, look, she's done the child's hair. Isn't that sweet? Elias and I are old friends, you understand, very old, very dear friends. Maggie was my particular companion, God rest her, and I promised her on her deathbed I'd look after Elias and those babies. I've been looking after them for 2 years. The smile sharpened. "I'm sure you'll be a great help around the house." He always did need a good, strong girl to manage the heavy work. Hattie had met 100 Genevieve Ashbys in her life. You did not get to be a large woman of 36 without learning the whole species by heart, the way they wrapped their cruelty and courtesy so that if you flinched you looked like the rude one. She did not flinch. "How kind of you to have looked after them," Hattie said, and she made her voice warm as fresh milk, because the only thing that truly disarms that kind of woman is a kindness she can't find the hook in. "The children have spoken so well of the neighbors. I know Mr. Crane's been grateful for every hand. It's a hard thing, raising little ones alone, and it takes a whole town's worth of goodness to do it, doesn't it? I'm sure you did what you could." And she smiled, and she let the words did what you could sit there, gentle and immovable, and she watched Genevieve understand that she had come at a wall and not a door, and did not like it. "Well," Genevieve said, her smile had gone thin, "I'm sure you'll do your best. Do give Elias my regards. Tell him I'll be by with a pie this week, as I always do. He's so fond of my pies." And she swept away with her aids, and Hattie stood in the churchyard sun with her 2 children pressed against her skirts, and she let out a breath, and Samuel looked up at her and said, "Lo, I don't like her. She smells like flowers, but she pinches." She pinched Ada once when Papa wasn't looking, and said if Ada told, nobody would believe her. And Hattie's warm milk went cold in her veins, and she knelt down there in the churchyard, heavy and slow, until she was level with the boy's face. And she said, "Samuel, did she truly do that?" And the boy nodded, and Ada nodded against her skirts, and Hattie stood back up and looked across the churchyard at the retreating black-clad figure, and made herself a quiet promise that had nothing warm in it at all. She did not tell Elias. That was perhaps her mistake, though she made it for the right reasons. She did not tell him because she did not yet know how much a wife's word would weigh against an old friend's in that house, and because she did not want to be the woman who came into a home and started at once tearing down the people already in it, and because she thought, wrongly, that she could handle Genevieve Ashby herself. She had handled worse. What she had not accounted for was that Genevieve was not merely cruel. Genevieve was frightened, in the particular way of a woman who has built her whole standing in a town on being the one everyone expected a certain man to marry, and who has just watched that man marry someone else, someone she could dismiss with a glance, and yet who had not, somehow, been dismissed. A cruel woman you can outlast. A frightened one will burn the house down before she'll let it belong to anybody else. The pie arrived that Thursday as promised, and Genevieve with it, in a fresh dress and a bonnet trimmed with ribbon, and she came at the hour she knew Elias would be near the house, dinner hour, and she made a great show of it. She swept into the kitchen where Hattie was rolling out biscuits, and she set her pie down on Hattie's clean table, and she said, gaily, for Elias's benefit, "Now don't you fret. I know you've got your hands full. So I've brought Elias his favorite dried peach, the way I always make it. Elias, come and see, I've brought your peach pie." And Elias came in from the yard, and Hattie watched him look at Genevieve, and then at her, at Hattie, flour to the elbows and biscuits on the board, and she watched him try to find his footing between the woman who had been part of his grief for 2 years and the woman who had been part of his healing for 3 weeks, and she saw that he did not know how to stand between them, that he was a man who had lost the habit of standing anywhere at all. "That's kind of you, Genevieve," Elias said. "You didn't have to." "Oh, but I did," Genevieve said. "Somebody has to make sure you're properly looked after, a man in your position. She let her eyes flick to Hattie, quick, a blade. I only worry you'll be eating heavy from now on. You want to watch that. It's easy to let a house go soft. And she laughed, light, as though it were nothing, as though everyone in the room did not understand exactly what she meant and at whom it was aimed. Hattie kept rolling her biscuits. She did not look up. But Ada, who was sitting in the corner with her rag doll, Ada, who was 7 and had already learned more about the ways of cruel women than any child should. Ada stood up and marched across the kitchen and put herself in front of Hattie's skirts like a small, furious sentinel and said, in a high, clear voice, "You're being mean. You're being mean to my Hattie, and I want you to go home." The kitchen went very still. Ada stood there, trembling with her own daring, her little fists balled at her sides, and the word "my" hung in the air, my Hattie. And Hattie felt it go into her like warmth into cold hands, almost painful, the blood coming back to a place that had been numb so long she'd forgotten it could feel. Genevieve's face did an ugly thing, there and gone, and she opened her mouth, and it was then that Elias Crane finally found the ground to stand on. "Ada," he said, "go on out and see to the chickens." And when the child had gone, casting one last defiant look over her shoulder, Elias turned to Genevieve, and he said, in a voice Hattie had not heard from him before, quiet and level and final, "Genevieve, I'm grateful for what you did these 2 years. I mean that. You were good to Maggie, and you were good to the children when I couldn't be. But Mrs. Dunmore is my wife now, and this is her kitchen, and I'll not have her spoken to that way in it. Not by you. Not by anybody. Take your pie home. You didn't make it for us anyhow. You made it to prove a point, and the point's been made, and it's not the one you wanted." He picked up the pie and held it out to her. "I'll see you Sunday. Give my regards to your father." Genevieve took the pie. Her hands were shaking, and her face had gone white and then red, and for just a moment, before the mask came back down, Hattie saw the frightened woman underneath and felt, to her own surprise, something almost like pity. Then the mask returned, and Genevieve smiled her Cedar Bend smile, and she said, sweet as poison, "Of course. I understand completely. I only hope, Elias, that you know what you've brought into your home. You know so little about her after all. A woman shows up from nowhere, with nothing, no people, no history a body can check on. I'd want to be careful, is all, with 2 little ones in the house. But you always did leap before you looked. Poor Maggie used to say the same." And she left, and the door closed behind her, and her words stayed in the room like smoke after a fire. Hattie went back to her biscuits. Her hands were steady, but her heart was not, because Genevieve had found the one true crack in the wall and driven her blade straight into it. Elias knew almost nothing about her. That was true. He had married a photograph and a handful of letters and a stranger off a coach, and everything he knew of her he had learned in 3 weeks, and a clever, cruel woman had just planted in his mind the suggestion that those 3 weeks might be a performance, that the bread and the braids and the scrubbed corners might be the bait in a trap. Hattie knew there was no trap. But she also knew that a seed like that, once planted, grows in the dark, whether you water it or not. And she wondered how long it would be before it broke the surface. It was that night, though, that something else grew instead. After the children were asleep, Elias did not go straight to the barn as he always did. He lingered in the kitchen while Hattie banked the fire. And he stood turning his hat in his hands, and finally he said, "I owe you an apology. I should have said all that the first Sunday, in the churchyard. I heard what the town said. I heard it and I said nothing. And I let you walk into that church and take it alone, and that was a coward's thing to do, and I'm ashamed of it." He looked at her, and the winter was almost gone from his eyes now. There was something else there, something she was afraid to name. "You've done more for those children in 3 weeks than I managed in 2 years. Ada sleeps. Samuel talks. He talked to me yesterday out at the corral, told me a whole long story about a horse toad he found. And I stood there like a fool trying not to cry because my boy was telling me about a toad. You did that. You brought my children back to me. And I've been sleeping in the barn and calling you Mrs. Dunmore and telling myself I don't want a wife. And the truth is," he stopped. He put his hat back on his head, which was what he did, she had learned, when he had come too near a feeling and needed to retreat. "The truth is, I don't rightly know what the truth is anymore," he said. "Good night, Hattie," and it was the first time he had called her by her name, and he went out to the barn, and Hattie stood in the warm, dark kitchen with her hand pressed to her mouth and did not sleep for a long time. The summer came on, and with it the long, golden work of the ranching year, and Hattie found her place in the turning of it. She kept a garden now, a good one, coaxed out of the hard ground with manure and prayer and stubbornness, and by July she had beans climbing the fence and squash sprawling fat across the rows and tomatoes reddening on the vine. And she put up preserves against the winter until the pantry that had stood near empty when she came now gleamed with jars in the lamplight. She learned the ranch. She learned to doctor a calf and to know the weather by the color of the morning and to shoot the rifle Elias taught her to shoot, planting her broad feet and steadying the barrel against a fence post. And the first time she brought down a coyote that had been after the chickens, Samuel looked at her with such naked worship that she had to turn away to hide her laugh. And she and Elias grew, slowly, the way the garden grew, a little each day, invisible if you watched for it, and undeniable if you looked away and came back. He moved his sleeping to the far end of the house instead of the barn, when the nights turned cold, but it was more than that. It was the way he began to save things up through the day to tell her at supper. It was the way his hand found the small of her back when they came through a doorway together, brief, almost accidental, except that it happened every time. It was the way he said her name. Hattie, who had gone 36 years being looked past, found herself, in the deep of that Wyoming summer, being looked at by a good, tired man who had stopped seeing the shape of her body somewhere along the way and started seeing her. And she did not know what to do with it, and she was almost angry at how frightened it made her. Because she had built her whole life on the certainty that this would never come to her, and now that it was coming, she did not trust it, could not trust it, kept waiting for the trick. The children had no such doubts. To the children, it was already settled. Samuel had taken to calling her Hattie the way you'd call any beloved fixed thing by its name. And he followed her about the place with a quiet devotion, learning to sew and to bake and to read from the one book she'd brought, a worn Bible with her mother's name in the front. And Ada, who had started it all with her question at the wagon, had simply folded Hattie into her heart without ceremony, the way small children do, holding her hand, climbing into her lap. Pressing her face into Hattie's soft shoulder when she was sleepy, which was the very softness the town had mocked, and Hattie thought sometimes, holding the child, that God had a sense of humor after all, to make the same body a shame in one place and a comfort in another. There was a Sunday in high summer that Hattie kept folded away in her memory ever after. a plain, ordinary Sunday that turned out to be one of the days a life is secretly made of. Elias had no pressing work, a rare thing, and the morning was fine and blue. And on a whim that surprised them all, he announced after church that they would go down to the creek and have their dinner there, out of doors, like folks with nothing better to do. So Hattie packed a basket, cold chicken and bread and pickles and a jar of her strawberry preserves and a whole spice cake, and they drove the wagon down to the willows where the creek ran wide and slow over the stones, and they spread a quilt in the shade, and for one whole golden afternoon the Crane family did nothing useful whatsoever. And it was, Hattie thought, the most useful thing they had done all summer. Elias taught Samuel to fish that afternoon, the two of them standing thigh-deep in the cool water with cut willow poles, and Hattie sat on the bank with Ada and watched them, the tall, gray, templed man and the dark-haired boy, their two heads bent together over the water, the man's low voice explaining the way of it, patient, and the boy's face lit with the fierce concentration of a child being taught something by a father who is truly there. Samuel caught a trout, his first, a small, bright thing that flashed silver in the sun, and he shouted with a joy so pure and so loud that a heron went up off the far bank in a great, slow beating of wings, and Elias laughed. Actually laughed. A sound Hattie had never once heard from him in all the weeks she'd been in his house. A deep, rusty laugh, like a pump that hasn't been worked in years finally drawing water, and Hattie sat on the bank with her hand pressed to her breastbone and thought she had never heard a finer sound in all her days. Later, when the children had worn themselves out and lay dozing on the quilt in the dappled shade, Elias came and sat beside Hattie on the bank, closer than he needed to, and he watched the water go by, and he said, "After a long while, I haven't laughed like that since before. I'd forgot I could." He picked up a flat stone and turned it in his fingers. There was a time I thought laughing was a thing I'd used up, like a field you plant too many years running till there's nothing left in the soil. I thought Maggie took the last of it with her. He skipped the stone out across the slow water. 3 skips, 4, "You've got a way of putting things back that I'd give up for gone," he said. The laughing. The children. This, he gestured, a small motion of his hand that took in the creek and the willows and the sleeping children and the woman beside him, all of it, the whole warm afternoon. "I don't know what I did to deserve you coming up that road. I know I looked at you like a fool that first day. I've been ashamed of that every day since." And Hattie, who did not trust words, who had been burned too often by pretty words that meant nothing, looked at this plain man skipping stones and saying the truest, hardest things in the flattest, quietest voice. And she believed every word, and she reached over and took his hand where it rested on the grass, and neither of them said anything more, and neither of them needed to. The creek ran on. The children slept. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything she had never let herself pray for, handed to her on a quilt in the shade on an ordinary Sunday, and she held on to his rough hand and let herself, for once, simply be happy, without bracing for the loss of it. That was the summer Hattie stopped bracing. It did not happen all at once. But somewhere in those long gold weeks, between the garden and the fishing and the small daily kindnesses that piled up like snow until they buried the old cold ground of her doubt, Hattie Dunmore began, cautiously, the way you test ice before you trust your weight to it, to believe that she was allowed to keep this, that it was not alone the world would call back in, that she had not stolen it and would not be found out. It was the hardest lesson of her life, harder than any hardship, for hardship she had always known how to bear. It was joy she had never learned to hold. But she was learning it now, out here in the high summer country, with a good man and 2 mending children, learning to open her hands and let herself be given to. And it was the making of her. But the seed Genevieve had planted was growing too, in the dark as Hattie had known it would, and it broke the surface on a gray day in August, and it very nearly took everything down with it. A man rode out to the Crane ranch, a stranger, a heavy-set man in a checked coat, with a lawyer's soft hands and a hard little mouth, and he asked for Elias. And when Elias came, he handed him a paper and said he'd come from Ohio on the matter of the estate of one Josiah Dunmore, deceased, and the outstanding debts thereof, and did Mr. Crane know that the debts of Josiah Dunmore, some $400, now fell by law and marriage upon the shoulders of Josiah's widow, and therefore upon Mr. Crane himself. $400. It was a fortune. It was the whole thin margin by which the ranch survived a winter. And Hattie, standing in the doorway with her hands gone to ice, understood 2 things at once. She understood that the debt was real, that she had told Elias about it in her very first letter, and he had said it didn't signify, but that $400 was a different thing spoken of in a letter than it was standing on your porch in a checked coat. And she understood, from the particular satisfied way the lawyer glanced toward town as he spoke, exactly who had written to Ohio to dig the debt up and set it loose. Elias read the paper twice, and he paid the lawyer's insolent question no answer at all, only told the man he'd have his reply through the proper channels and to get off his land, and the lawyer smiled his hard little smile and got. But that night Elias did not come in to supper. He stayed out in the barn with the lamp burning late, and when Hattie carried a plate out to him, he took it without meeting her eyes, and the winter was back in him, thick and gray, the way it had been the first day at the coach. He was not angry at her. That was almost the worst of it. If he had been angry, she could have fought it. But he was not angry. He was afraid. The deep old fear of a man who has already lost one family to this hard country and now sees the second one threatened, and fear turned him back to stone, and the stone shut her out. For 3 days it went like that. He was courteous, and he was distant, and he did the work of the ranch with a grim silence that frightened the children. And Hattie watched the family she had spent a summer knitting together begin to come apart at the seams over $400 and a cruel woman's spite. And she lay awake in the loft and did the arithmetic of it, over and over, and every way she added it up, it came to the same sum. The debt was hers. She had brought it into this house on her own 2 feet. Elias had married a photograph, and the photograph had come with a lien on it, and now this good man and these 2 children she loved more than her own life were going to lose their winter margin, maybe their land, because Hattie Dunmore had wanted just once, just this one time, to be chosen. And she understood. Lying there in the dark, listening to Ada breathe easy in the bed she had taught her to sleep easy in, what she had to do. She would go. If she left, if she went quietly back to Ohio and let the marriage be set aside, the debt would go with her, would fall back on Josiah's estate where it belonged and not on Elias at all. She had read enough of the paper to understand that much. The lawyer had made his threat on the strength of the marriage, unmake the marriage, and the threat unmade itself. It would cost her everything she had found, this home, this hearth, these children, this good man who had just begun to look at her, and it would cost her quietly, the way she had always paid so that no one would be troubled by the sound of it. She had been a disappointment to folks before. She knew how to do it quietly. She had told him so that very first day, standing in the dust of the Cedar Bend Road, and she had not known then that she was telling him the truth about how their story would end. She began to pack that night, in the dark, a little at a time, so the children wouldn't wake. She had come with one carpetbag, and she would leave with one carpetbag, and she folded her 2 dresses and her mother's shawl and her tobacco tin of buttons, and she was reaching for the worn Bible on the shelf by Ada's bed when she heard the small voice behind her say, "What are you doing?" And she turned, and there was Ada sitting up in her bed in her nightdress, her loose braids come half undone in her sleep, her eyes huge in the dark, and behind her, in the other bed, Samuel was awake too, propped on one elbow, watching. And Hattie knew from the boy's face that he already understood, that he had understood from the first, because Samuel always understood the hard things first. "You're leaving," Samuel said. "It was not a question. You're leaving like the other ladies. You said you wouldn't. You promised. You said you don't make promises you don't keep." His voice cracked on the last word, and the crack in it went straight through Hattie's chest and out the other side. "Samuel," she said, and her own voice was not steady now, not at all. "Listen to me. I have to. There's a debt, a money that's owed, and it's mine. I brought it. And if I stay, it falls on your papa, and it could take the ranch, take your home, and I can't let that happen to you. Do you understand? I love you too much to let that happen. If I go, the debt goes with me, and you and Ada and your papa get to keep everything. That's why. It's the only reason. It is the last thing on this earth I want to do." And then Ada climbed down out of her bed, slow, and she came across the loft floor in her bare feet, and she stood in front of Hattie, this child who had asked the first question on the very first day, and she asked it again now, the same question, the only question, the one that had been growing in her small heart all summer long until it was too big to hold any longer. She reached up and took Hattie's face in both her small hands, the way a mother holds a child's face, having learned it from being held that way, and she looked into Hattie's eyes, and she said, "Will you be our mama? You never said yes. All summer you never said yes. But I don't care about the money. I don't care about anything. I just want you to be our mama. Please, please be our mama, and don't go." And Hattie Dunmore, who had held herself together through a churchyard full of whispers, through Genevieve Ashby's poison, through 36 years of being looked past by a world that had no room for a woman her size, Hattie Dunmore broke. She broke the way the ice breaks on the river in the spring, all at once, with a sound like something tearing. And she went down onto her knees on the loft floor, heavy and graceless and past all caring, and she gathered both children into her arms, and she wept in a way she had not let herself weep in years. Great racking sobs that shook her whole soft body, and the children clung to her and cried too, and the 3 of them knelt there in the dark loft and held on to each other like the last 3. People left in the world. Yes, Hattie said, when she could speak, into Ada's hair, into Samuel's shoulder, into the warm and desperate tangle of them. Yes, yes, I'll be your mama. God forgive me, I don't know how I'll do it or how we'll pay what's owed or how any of it will come right, but yes, I'm your mama, and mamas don't leave, and I'm not leaving, do you hear me? I'm not going anywhere, I'm staying. And she said it like a prayer, like a vow, staying, and she did not hear the ladder creak, did not know how long Elias had been standing at the top of it until she felt his hand come down on her shoulder and looked up and saw her husband's face wet with tears in the dark. He had heard all of it. He had come up to check on the children, as he did every night now, quiet. And he had heard the boy say, "You promised," and he had heard the girl say, "Be our mama," and he had heard his wife say the debt was hers to carry alone. And he had stood there on the ladder and understood, all at once and far too late, what a fool he had been. He had let $400 and 3 days of fear undo a whole summer of grace. He had let this woman lie awake, making herself the sacrifice, planning to slip away in the dark and take the blame and the debt and her whole battered, generous heart back to Ohio so that he could keep his land. And he had let her do it because he had been too lost in his own old grief to see that grief was exactly the thing she had spent all summer curing in this house. One loaf and one braid and one kind word at a time. "Get up," Elias said, and his voice was rough as gravel, and he reached down and took her by both arms and drew her up off the floor. This big woman that the town said no man would have drew her up as though she weighed nothing, as though she were precious. "Get up off that floor, Hattie Crane, and don't you ever let me catch you packing that bag again." He held her by the arms, and he looked at her, and there was no winter left in him anywhere. It was all gone, burned clean out. "You think I'd let you walk back to Ohio over money? You think I married you for a photograph and I'd send you off over a lien? Woman, I have been the biggest fool in the Wind River country these 3 days, and I have got a great deal to answer for, but I am not fool enough for that. The debt's already paid. I sold the north pasture to Amos Tucker this afternoon, 40 acres of bottomland, and I'd sell 40 more and the shirt off my back besides before I'd let you go. You are not a debt I got saddled with. You are the best thing that ever walked up that road. And I have been too proud and too scared to say it, and I'm saying it now in front of my children so they can hold me to it. I love you. I have loved you since the night you told me I wasn't God and I couldn't have stopped the snow. Now, for God's sake, stop crying, all 3 of you, or you'll have me doing it too, and a man's got to keep back some dignity." They were all 4 of them a wreck of tears and laughter by then, and it was Ada, practical as her father, who broke it, announcing into the wet quiet that if everybody was done crying she was hungry, and did being a mama mean Hattie would make the cinnamon bread now, even though it was the middle of the night. And Hattie laughed, a great broken, wonderful laugh, and wiped her face with the heel of her hand, and said that yes, she supposed being a mama meant exactly that. And they all went down the ladder together, and Hattie lit the stove and made cinnamon bread at 2 o'clock in the morning, while her husband held their daughter half asleep against his shoulder, and their son sat close against Hattie's side, watching the dough rise. And it was. Hattie would say for the rest of her long life, the finest meal she ever made in a lifetime of making meals, that middle-of-the-night bread, eaten warm by lamplight by 4 people who had almost lost each other and had not, after all, lost each other at all. She did not sleep much that night, but it was a different not sleeping than the nights before. She lay awake for the sheer joy of being awake in a house where she was loved, listening to the small sounds of it, the tick of the cooling stove, the wind at the eaves, the breathing of the children, the heavier breath of the man asleep at last in his own house with no winter in him, and she thought about the strange, long road that had brought her here. The Ohio farm, and Josiah, and the fever, and the debts, and the photograph she'd sent from the shoulders up in soft light, and she thought that she would not change a single hard step of it, not one, because every step had been leading her here, to this loft, to this hearth, to these people, and a road that leads you home is a good road, even when it breaks your feet. The matter of Genevieve Ashby resolved itself, in the end, the way such matters do in a small town, which is to say, slowly and then all at once. Amos Tucker, the old rancher who had bought the north pasture, was not a man who could keep a thing to himself, and it was not a week before the whole of Cedar Bend knew that Elias Crane had sold 40 acres of prime bottomland to pay off a debt that had been dug up out of Ohio by a letter, and folks began, in the way of small towns, to wonder who would trouble themselves to write to Ohio about the private debts of a heavyset widow 6 weeks married. It did not take them long to wander in the right direction. Genevieve had never been as clever as she believed herself, and she had bragged to the wrong woman in the way that frightened, cruel people always eventually brag, and the wrong woman told another wrong woman. And by the time it had gone around the town twice, everyone knew that the fine, slender widow Ashby had tried to ruin a good man's marriage out of spite, and had nearly cost his children their home, and had done it with a smile and a peach pie, and the town, which had been so ready to whisper about the size of Hattie's body, discovered that it had a great deal more to say about the size of Genevieve's heart. But it was not the town's turning against Genevieve that won Hattie her place in Cedar Bend. Towns turn against people easily. It cost them nothing, and Hattie had lived long enough to put no stock in a welcome built only on somebody else's disgrace. What won her the town was bread. It had started small, back in the early summer, before any of the trouble. Hattie baked more than 4 people could eat. She couldn't seem to help it. Baking was how she loved, and she had a great deal of love stored up from all the years of having nowhere to put it. And on the Saturdays when Elias drove into town for supplies, she had begun sending along a basket of the extra. Loaves and rolls, and once a great tray of cinnamon buns, telling him to leave it at the church for whoever needed feeding. And the poor of Cedar Bend, the widow Pratt, with her 6 children, the old blind man who lived behind the livery, the Hanson family whose crops had failed, they had eaten Hattie Crane's bread all that summer, and it was good bread. It was the best bread any of them had ever eaten, and bread eaten in a hungry season is a thing a body remembers. So that when the tide turned against Genevieve, it did not simply leave Hattie standing where she had been, tolerated and whispered about. It lifted her. The widow Pratt stood up in the general store and said she'd not hear a word against Mrs. Crane, who had fed her babies when nobody else troubled to notice they were hungry, and the old blind man told anyone who'd listen that he could tell more about a soul from how they treated a blind beggar than from the shape of their body, and that Mrs. Crane had a soul like her bread, warm all the way through. And the churchwomen who had leaned their heads together that first Sunday came out, one by one, a little shamefaced, to the Crane Ranch, with their own baskets now, seed for the garden, a setting of eggs, a pattern for a child's dress, the small currency of frontier friendship. And Hattie took each of them in and gave them coffee and sent them home with a loaf, and never once, to her lasting credit, said a word to remind them how they had first looked at her. She had been looked at that way too many times to wish it on another soul, even the ones who'd done the looking. Genevieve Ashby left Cedar Bend before the first snow. She went to a sister in Denver, it was said, and Hattie hoped, without any bitterness, that she found some peace there, some place where the fear that drove her might finally let go its grip, because Hattie understood now. From the safe far shore of being loved, that Genevieve had been drowning in the same cold water Hattie had spent her own life in. The water of believing you must earn your place in the world by being the right shape or the right sort, and that Genevieve had simply chosen to pull others under rather than learn to swim. Hattie had been pulled under by such people her whole life. She found she could not hate the last one, now that she was standing on dry land at last. It was Elias who decided they should be married again, properly in the church, in front of God and the whole of Cedar Bend. They were married already, of course, in law, by the proxy vows they had spoken through the mail before ever they met. But Elias said that a marriage begun on a photograph and a lie of omission deserved to be begun again on the truth, out loud, where everyone could see it. And Hattie, who had never had a wedding, only a signing of papers in a lawyer's office with Josiah looking at his watch, wept when he asked her and said yes, and this time the yes came easy. She was married on a bright, cold morning in October, in a dress the church women had helped her sew, a deep blue wool that fit her as she was, made for her body instead of let out to suffer it. And she did not try to hide inside it. She stood up in it, broad and tall and unashamed, and she walked up the aisle of the little church on the arm of old Amos Tucker, who had asked to give her away and cried through the whole of it. Ada walked ahead, scattering the last of the summer's dried flower petals from a basket, in a dress, with a loose braid tied in blue ribbon. And Samuel stood up front beside his father in a Sunday shirt with every button the right color, holding the ring, so grave and so proud that half the congregation was undone before the vows even started. And Elias Crane, who was not a man for words, stood up in front of the whole town that had whispered about his wife, and he said his vows in a voice that carried to the back pew and did not shake. And when the preacher said he could kiss his bride, he took Hattie's round, flushed face in his two rough hands, gentle, the way his daughter had taken it in the dark loft that night, and he kissed her, and the church, which had come half to gawk, stayed to cheer. They had a supper after, in the churchyard where Hattie had once stood alone and taken the whispers. And this time the whole town came, and the tables groaned with food, and Hattie's bread was on every one of them, and there was fiddle music and dancing, and Elias danced with her. This big woman he'd been ashamed to see step off the coach 5 months before, danced with her slow in the churchyard in the October light, while the town watched and did not whisper anything at all, except how happy they looked. And Hattie put her head on her husband's shoulder and thought her heart could not hold another ounce of joy without breaking, and was wrong about that, as it turned out, because there was a great deal more joy still coming to her, years and years of it, but she did not know that yet, and so she simply danced, and was grateful, and did not ask the future for more than the day had already given. The first snow came in November, and Hattie had been dreading it quietly on Elias's account, because she knew what snow meant in that house, knew that the sight of it falling had for 2 years been the sight of the thing that killed his Maggie and their unborn child, and she watched him go still and gray at the kitchen window the morning the first flakes came down, watched the old winter try to come back into his eyes. But this time she did not leave him to it. This time she came and stood beside him at the window, and she took his hand, and she did not say anything for a while, and then she said quietly, "It's just snow, Elias. It's not a judgment, and it's not a debt, and it's not your fault. It's just the sky doing what the sky does. Maggie's at peace. The snow can't hurt her any more, and it can't hurt us, because we're all four of us right here inside where it's warm. And that's on account of you built this house tight and true, and you keep it that way. Let it snow. Let it snow all at once. We're home, and we're warm, and nobody's going out in it tonight. And she felt the stone in him give, felt his hand tighten on hers, felt him let out a breath he had been holding for 2 winters, and he turned from the window and looked at her, and he said, "How do you do that? How do you always know the thing to say?" And she said, "Because I spent 36 years on the cold side of the glass, Elias, I know exactly what it looks like from out there. And I made myself a promise a long time ago that if I ever got to the warm side, I'd never once forget the folks still standing in the snow." And he pulled her against him, and they watched the snow come down together, unafraid, and behind them the children played on the warm floor by the stove, and the house held them all, tight and true. That was a good winter, the first good winter the Crane house had known in a long time. The snow came deep, and the wind howled down out of the mountains, and none of it mattered, because inside the house was warm and full and loud with living. Hattie taught the children their letters at the kitchen table by lamplight through the long, dark evenings, and she and Elias fell into the deep, quiet companionship of 2 people who have chosen each other on purpose, which is a different and sturdier thing than the companionship of 2 people who merely fell together. He would sit of an evening mending harness while she sewed, and they would talk or not talk, and the not talking had become as easy between them as the talking, which is how you know a marriage has taken root. She learned the whole long story of his life, the boy he'd been in Missouri, the war he'd been too young for, and the brother he'd lost to it anyway, the dream of land that had carried him west, the guilt that had nearly killed him after Maggie. And she told him her own story, all of it now. The whole plain truth she'd been too afraid to put in a letter, the father who'd told her no man would ever want a girl her size, the years of being the one the other girls were kind to out of charity, the marriage to Josiah that had been less a love than a mutual arrangement between 2 people the world had passed over, the long grief of believing she would go to her grave unheld. And Elias listened to all of it, and when she was done he said only, "Your father was a fool, and Josiah was a fool, and I was a fool too for near half a year, and it's a wonder to me the good Lord gives fools like us the women we don't deserve." And Hattie laughed and cried a little and understood that she was, at last and for the first time in her whole life, entirely and unconditionally believed. She had wondered sometimes, in the dark early days, whether Elias's regard for her was a thing built only on gratitude, on what she'd done for the children, whether he valued her the way a man values a good hired hand or a well-made tool, useful and appreciated and not, in the end, beloved for herself. It was the old fear, the deep one, the one her father had planted and the world had watered for 36 years, that she could be needed but never wanted, that a body like hers might earn a place through service but never through simple being. It was Elias who finally rooted that fear out, and he did it not with grand words, he was no good at grand words, but with 10,000 small ones, over the months and the years. He did it by reaching for her hand across the table for no reason. He did it by the way his face changed when she came into a room, a loosening, a lifting, a thing he could not have hidden if he tried and never once tried to. He did it by telling her she was beautiful, plainly as a fact on an ordinary Tuesday with flour on her nose, and by getting angry, truly angry. The one time she tried to make herself small in front of company, taking her aside after and saying low and fierce, "Don't you do that. Don't you ever fold yourself up small to make some fool comfortable. You take up the room God gave you to take up. I didn't marry half a woman. I married the whole magnificent lot of you, and I'll not have you giving any of it back." And Hattie, who had spent her life apologizing for the space she took up in the world, learned slowly, under the steady sun of that man's love, to stop apologizing, to stand up to her full height, to feel her own life all the way to its edges, and it was the greatest gift anyone had ever given her, greater even than the children, greater than the home. He gave her back to herself. The years came on, good years, in the main, with the ordinary sorrows and joys that any family knows. There was a hard drought the third summer, and a winter the fourth that took half the herd, and there were nights Elias sat up worrying over the ledgers with his jaw tight. But they weathered it together, and Hattie's garden, and Hattie's economy, and Hattie's stubborn refusal to despair carried them through the lean times the way her bread had carried the poor of Cedar Bend through that first summer. And there were joys. Ada grew tall and strong and fierce, and never did lose the fierceness that had made her stand in front of Hattie's skirts against Genevieve Ashby, and she grew into a young woman who would not be talked down to by anyone, and Hattie was prouder of that fierceness than of anything. And Samuel grew quiet and steady and kind, and he learned everything Hattie could teach him, and everything his father could teach him besides, and when he was grown, he built a house on the north pasture that Elias bought back the very first year they could afford to. 40 acres of bottomland returned to the family that had sold it for love. And there was, in the second spring, a baby. Hattie had believed herself past the age and the hope of it, had made her peace with mothering the two she'd been given and asking heaven for nothing more. But the Lord, who has a sense of humor as Hattie had long suspected, saw fit to give the heavyset widow that no man was supposed to want a child of her own body at 38, a fat, healthy, squalling boy they named for old Amos Tucker, who wept at the christening as he had wept at the wedding, being a man who cried easily at good things, which Hattie had come to believe was the very best kind of man there was. And she held that baby in the same kitchen where she had baked the first loaf of bread, in the same house she had scrubbed the grief out of corner by corner. And she looked down at his small, furious face, and she thought about the long, cold road that had led her to this warm place, and she was not sorry for one step of it. Not one. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been that first day, standing in the dust of the Cedar Bend road with $4 and a carpetbag and a photograph that told half a truth, bracing herself against the whispers, telling a stranger she knew how to be a disappointment quietly. She wished she could go back and tell that woman something. She wished she could stand beside her in the dust and put an arm around those broad, tired shoulders and say, hold on, and keep your chin up just a little longer, because you are not walking toward another disappointment. You are walking toward the only place you have ever belonged. There are 2 children in a wagon up ahead who are going to look at your face instead of your body, who are going to ask you to be their mama before the day is out, and one day, on a cold October morning, a good man is going to take that same face in his 2 hands in front of the whole town that whispered about you and choose you out loud. And you are going to be so loved, so thoroughly and daily and unremarkably loved, that you will forget what it felt like to stand on the cold side of the glass. Hold on. It is all coming. Everything you stopped letting yourself want is coming up the road to meet you. Many years later, when the twins were grown and gone to homes of their own, and the baby was a long-legged boy of 10, there came an evening in early autumn that Hattie would hold in her heart as the truest picture of her whole life. It was nothing, really. It was only a supper. The whole family had come home for it, Ada with her husband and her own new baby. Samuel down from his house on the north pasture, and they crowded around the long plank table that Elias had built and that Hattie had set with a white cloth every night. For 20 years, and the lamplight was gold on all their faces, and Hattie brought the bread to the table, as she had brought the bread to the table 10,000 times. And she stopped for just a moment in the doorway of the kitchen with a warm loaf in her hands and looked at 'em all. There was her Ada, fierce and lovely, bouncing her own daughter on her knee. There was her Samuel, quiet and broad-shouldered now, so like his father that it took the breath from her. There was the baby that was no longer a baby, arguing cheerfully with his big sister about something that did not matter. And there at the head of the table was Elias, gray all through his hair and beard now, the winter finally gone from his eyes for good, worn soft and easy by 20 years of being loved, and he looked up and found her standing in the doorway, and he smiled at her, the particular smile he kept for her alone, and he said, "Come sit down, Hattie. The bread's not going anywhere, and neither are we." And she came, and she sat, and she took her husband's rough old hand in her own, and she looked around that golden crowded table at the whole enormous unlikely family that had grown up out of one carpetbag and one photograph and one small child's question in a wagon bed, and she understood. All the way to the bottom of her soul what her life had been for. She had come west a woman the world had thrown away. Too big, too plain, too old, too poor, a widow with $4 in a debt and no expectation left of ever being anything to anyone but a burden borne or a service rendered. And she had found, at the end of that hard road, the one thing she had stopped believing existed for a woman shaped like her. She had found a place where she was not tolerated but treasured, not needed but wanted, not looked past but looked at, seen, chosen, loved, day after ordinary day, by a good man and 3 good children and a whole town that had learned, from her bread and her patience and her refusal to grow small, that a heart is not measured in the same units as a waist, and that the biggest women are sometimes the ones with the most room inside to love. Ada had asked her that very first day, standing in a wagon with crooked braids and hungry eyes, "Are you going to be our mama?" And Hattie had not been able to say yes, not then, because she had not yet dared to believe that a thing so good could be meant for her. It had taken a debt and a betrayal and a night of tears on a dark loft floor to break the last of that old disbelief and let the yes come out. But it had come out, and it had been true. And she had been their mama, and Elias's wife, and Cedar Bend's own Mrs. Crane for the rest of her long, full life. And when she was very old, and it came her turn at last to go the way of Maggie and all the beloved lost, she went easy and unafraid, held on every side by the family she had built, and her last clear thought was not of the cold road she had walked in, nor of all the years of being unwanted, but of a warm kitchen full of gold lamplight and the faces of the people who had looked at her once when no one else would and seen everything she was. For Hattie Dunmore, who had walked up the road to the Crane Ranch with a carpetbag and a lie of omission and no place in all the world that wanted her, had found, at the end of that long journey, the one place she was always meant to be. She had been looked past her whole life, and then she had been looked at, and being looked at with love had made her whole. This was home, and she had stayed